And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter. Brett Vogelsinger has been teaching English for over 20 years and currently teaches a full schedule of students at Central Bucks High School South in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. He is the author of Poetry Pauses, Teaching with Poems to Elevate Student Writing in All Genres. He is also a regular contributor at Moving Writers and has been featured on Edutopia, NCTE Verse, NPR's Mind Shift podcast, and the New York Times Learning Network. His newest book with Corwin is Artful AI in Writing Instruction, a human-centered approach to using artificial intelligence in grades 6 through 12, and it is the topic of today's webinar. So now I will turn it over to Brett. Welcome, Brett.
Thanks, Margaret, and welcome everybody. It's so good to meet some of you who are traveling virtually from far and wide. I'll start with a little prologue and then we'll get into the meat of things. I'll let you know when the official webinar starts. But first, I want to comment that I started designing this presentation in the color orange long before Taylor Swift made the color orange all the rage right now. But I did want to use this as an opportunity to share something about the design of this PowerPoint today. You'll notice there's a little waterfall in the corner of the slide. And the waterfall is going to be a little symbol that we'll use when I'm looking for a waterfall of responses in the chat. So I will not be able to monitor the chat 100% of the time during our webinar. Margaret's going to keep an eye on any questions that we might have time for at the end. So if you have a question that pops in your head, feel free to put it there. I might just not get to it till the end. And then, but there are times when I'm going to pause, open the chat, and look at it. So this is one of those times because the waterfall asks for that waterfall of responses in the chat. So seriously, see if you can guess which page in this book has a Taylor Swift reference on it. I will tell you it's also a meaningful number for those of you that follow all the Taylor Swift. It's not page 13 and not page 4. Keep going. It's another number that we might relate to. Oh, Bernhard got it. 89, page 89 of the book. Of course, 1989, one of her albums, and the year she was born. So that's totally by accident, another coincidence alongside my orange design of this webinar's PowerPoint. So anyway, just a little fun fact. And that's how we'll use the waterfall logo. You're also going to notice at points throughout this presentation that I'll reference specific pages in the book. So the PowerPoint will tell you if I'm referring to a specific activity or detail, what page that's on. So the Taylor Swift reference and the use of Taylor Swift lyrics and AI is on page 89 in my book, quite by accident. So I say early on in the book that my feelings about AI and the teaching of writing really are most analogous to a tilt-a-whirl because I rise with excitement sometimes when I see something new come out or I come up with a new application, or really a lot of what I write in my book is based on student voices too. So many times a student will bring something to my attention or share a perspective that I hadn't thought about with AI. And that gives me a rise of excitement, but then I will just like crash with disappointment when a student uses it inappropriately, or when I see some of the risks involved, when I learn about environmental impacts. So I am really up and down and all around with this topic. So if you are too, I'm with you. And I would not consider myself an AI enthusiast, nor am I someone who is, burying my head in the sand or saying, pull out the blue books. I use a lot of paper in my class. I'm not all about technology. So if that's you, I'm with you. But I also feel like there are opportunities here if we take a nuanced look at how AI is used. And so I want you to know that I'm not here to push something on you. If there's ideas you hear in this webinar or in the book that you don't like, reject them. That's totally fine. We're new enough at this that we're all finding our way. But I hope that they can illuminate maybe a corner of this topic that you hadn't thought about before. I want to point out I attended ISTE in June, and I saw one of the presenters talking about AI. Becky Keene was her name, talked about the Gardner hype cycle and how whenever a piece of technology comes out and is new to us, there's this sort of stratospheric rise of expectation of what it can do until it reaches a peak of inflated expectations. And then people kind of get a little bit disillusioned with what it isn't able to do or how it might hurt them. For instance, when we all get addicted to our smartphones. And so it hits a trough of disillusionment and eventually a slope of enlightenment that leads to a plateau of productivity. And one thing that I'm trying to do, and let me see if it'll let me annotate this here. I think it will. I'm trying to do this. kind of avoid the highest peak and the lowest low and keep my attitude moving in that way so that I'm more quickly able to get to the point where it can be productive for student writers, if that makes some sense. I'd invite you to consider trying to avoid the extremes of emotion around this topic as well as we try to figure out the best way to approach it with our students. I also want to just comment as time develops and goes on. Ooh, it annotated and now it doesn't want to go away. That line. What have I done? Now there's going to be a line across my whole thing. Okay, we'll see if I can figure that out. Wait. Annotate, erase. That's going to bug me otherwise. All right, there we go. So there's a couple of things that are coming up in the lexicon that we're using to talk about AI that bug me a little bit right now. And I wanted to talk about these right up front. So many people talk about how students are using AI and are not necessarily acknowledging what a broad term that is. Because let's face it, using AI to say copy and paste material and present it as your own, which was sort of our first encounter with it for a lot of us, is very different than some of the ways that we'll talk about using AI today. There's also worse ways to use AI. I mean, what about the fact that now people can put AI into humanizers and create something and then make it sound more like them and become really deceptive with it? On the other hand, if we're looking for ways to rephrase a certain line, to push our thinking further, that use of AI has a very different connotation. So one article on my website, which you'll see linked later on, talks about how I really try to stay away from that term, like using AI, because it's such a broad blanket term. People also refer to artificial intelligence as a thought partner. And while I do think it can push us to deeper thinking, if used well, I hesitate to sell it to students as a thought partner because I think students are still, adults are still learning what exactly this is. And what we do know is it doesn't think. It approximates thought, it imitates thought, it does learn in a way and that it develops over time. But I'm hesitant to call it a thought partner because it maybe humanizes this technology a little too much for my comfort level right now in talking to students about it. And finally, the term AI literacy, which I think is actually a really important and interesting term to talk about. I want to make sure we don't overuse that term in a way that flattens it and really calls something AI literacy when we're talking about AI skills. So I often think of AI skills as like a flat circle, like think of a target, versus AI literacy that's really three-dimensional, has to do with the context of when we're using it, why we're using it. As an example, AI literacy in the workplace, which a lot of parents are using, is very different than AI literacy in the classroom, where we're trying to help students shape their perspectives and their skills as thinkers, which is not always the same objective as a workplace has when it asks someone to write. So these are a couple things I just wanted to hit first, and now is the official start where we dig into Artful AI and writing instruction. I first want to comment a little bit about that title. If you've read the book, you may have been surprised to note that one of the first, every chapter begins with a quote from a writer. And I quoted Ted Chiang's article from The New Yorker, Why AI Isn't Going to Make Art. And that's a counterintuitive place to go for a quote from almost a year ago now, on August 31st, 2024, in my book, Artful AI. But let me share this quote from Ted Chiang that I think is really, really important to start with. He says, art is something that results from making a lot of choices. I love that way of looking at it, that art is an abundance of choices distilled into a final product of some kind, a painting, a movie, a short story, an essay. And he's saying that if AI doesn't really make choices and therefore can't create art, something I actually agree with. In fact, I want to share with you this little animation that's used on the New Yorker website, which I think, oversimplifies AI, but the idea of a Roomba having a paintbrush taped to it and trying to create a piece of art is sort of an entertaining way of sharing what Ted Chiang's point is in this article. However, I guess what I'm wondering in this book and what I'm exploring as a teacher is, and I'm exploring it live in the classroom with kids in real time, is an extension of a question I've always asked about digital tools. 15 years ago, when I got a digital editing station for my classroom and was first able to, with all kinds of doodads, not just a phone with a camera built in, able to make movies with students, I thought, well, that has an element of fun to it, right? Making a movie with a student, but how can it help them to think deeply or create beautifully with this tool? And I think that question persists as we work with AI, but changes just a little bit. So watch on the next slide how I'm going to change that question just a little bit. We've always asked that about our use of technology. But I think we need to demand a little bit more of generative AI. And how can students think deeply and create beautifully with generative AI? Because I think AI can create some things that can push students to think deeply, but if it doesn't lead to a result that's beautiful in some way, isn't that great? And it can also create things that have an element of beauty to them, but if they shortchanged the student's thinking, it's really not great. That's what we're all sort of afraid of. We don't want to lose. So I think it's important to hold generative AI to both standards. And I hope to share with you four practical things from the book and adapted from the book with a few other little details woven in that also appear in the book, most of them, that can help us to hold this standard, that use this technology in a way that helps students think deeply and create beautifully. So I'm going to share strategy number one, which I call in the book the rubber duck. And I didn't make that up. That is a term used by computer programmers who have typically used this idea that sometimes when you're stuck and you're trying to figure out a problem in programming, it helps to have a quote rubber duck or something inanimate to talk to, because giving voice to what you're thinking about or trying to solve helps you to solve it. My wife teases me a lot because sometimes I'll be just like quietly sitting there and she's like, "Who are you talking to?" Because that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to solve a problem in my head and I'm starting to like make facial expressions and gesture like I'm doing now. Because verbalizing a problem and what we're thinking about can help us to reach a solution. So, can we help use AI as that rubber duck that talks back a little bit and helps us to think through our own ideas rather than give us the ideas in the first place? So I'm going to give an example. And throughout tonight's presentation, just for the sake of simplicity, I want to give a couple different examples. This one is going to have a waterfall response, you'll notice, so you want to have your chat ready in a minute. I'm going to give an example from a 10th grade class working with two short stories, The Waltz, a humorous piece by Dorothy Parker about a woman who's waiting to be asked to dance and hating the whole like social construct of how dances work, and then gets the guy who asks her is this terrible dancer, and it's this horrible experience. And if you know Dorothy Parker's work, you know she does that in this wonderfully sarcastic, funny way. And then The Lottery, a much darker short story, famous. Many of us were probably traumatized by it as students. And if you teach English, you're still using it that way today, with that wicked twist at the end where we find out the winner of the lottery is actually going to be stoned to death by everyone else in the village. Two very different stories. So I want to share how we could use AI as a rubber duck for writing about these stories. In this prompt, I want you to notice the student has already learned that telling an artificial intelligence tool who you are and what you are doing is really helpful for the first line. So I'm a 10th grade English student learning about tone. Then they go on, I want to write about the difference in tone between the Waltz by Dorothy Parker and The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. I'm already writing about how diction and dialogue contribute to the tone in both stories. I'm going to step outside that and be teacher voice for a second. I'm going to say, I like this. The student has already done some thinking. They're clear on what they want to write about, the difference in tone, and they're clear about some details. So they brainstormed already, and that is so, so important. We don't want AI brainstorming for us, taking away our ability to initiate good ideas. This student already has some good ideas. They paid attention in class. They're taking it and they're saying, what other elements should I think about for my writing? That is such a great question to use in a prompt. Here's what I've already got. What other things should I consider? Now, here's what I'm going to ask in the waterfall response. So if you could, in the chat, type a response to this question. As you look over the response this one came from Claude AI, by the way, is the one I'm demonstrating tonight. As you look over the response, what do you notice about the response that interests you, good, bad, or otherwise, in this response when the student has done some thinking out loud to the rubber duck, but the rubber duck answers back. So they've verbalized their thinking, and now the AI gives something to push their thinking a little bit. Doesn't have to be complete sentences, just some things that you notice. So I'm seeing things like it poses more questions, it's personalizing, the response prompts for the question, more coaching than giving an answer. It doesn't just give a response to copy. Good, it provides deeper thinking. I think demonstrating something like this live with your classroom could be really helpful. And I think your response might not be as excellent as this one, right? You might get a response that doesn't give questions, but likely you will because of how you framed the prompt. What other elements should I be thinking about for my writing? So it gave some elements and some things to think about without telling them what exactly to write about. Katie, that's a great way of saying it. It prompts deeper thinking. Um, oh, I like that, Bernhard. Could be found in the latest study mode of ChatGPT. I did this before that came out, and yet this is absolutely something that they're aspiring to. Very good. I'm going to put the chat away for a second. You can keep responding if you'd like, but I want you to zero in on number two, symbolism. Because for me, even as the teacher of these two stories, I mean, sure, I knew the black dot and the lottery and their symbolism, but I like how it prompts me to think about what the lottery represents in Jackson's story, because here's what my brain does with that next. And I could do what I'm doing for you now in front of my class and model this. When I read that response from the AI, that the lottery could represent something to be symbolic, that's not something we really dug into in class. I'm thinking about how it relates to a difference in tone, which is my focus for what I want to write about. But you know what it makes me question? What if the waltz, the act of the dance, is also symbolic? And now I start thinking about how in Dorothy Parker's story, maybe that waltz has to do with like the dance, the social interactions we're expected to do. Just like waltzing and dancing has its rules. What if this is really a story about living up to social expectations and there's symbolism there? Now, will that fit in my final paper about tone? I'm not sure, but I like that the AI didn't bring it up, but it made my mind go there. I'm not going to model it, but I could do the same thing for point of view. It definitely made me think about something that's not typically part of our lesson. So I want to point this out. And this is really an idea that I want to give credit to John Spencer for, Dr. John Spencer. Sometimes that step three of our brainstorm is where the best ideas happen or best ideas hide. If step one is get your own ideas together, that idea about diction and dialogue, step two might be saying, what did I miss? What else should I be considering? And getting some prompts, really asking the AI to prompt us. And step three is, what do I think of on my own? Like I just demonstrated about symbolism and the story of the waltz, which wasn't even hinted at in the original response from AI. So help kids to appreciate having AI brainstorm for you is a sad shortcut that takes like the joy out of your writing. But this, what we just did here, is not. It can be so much more than that. I want to give you an example of strategy number two, a diving board. And this one uses an AI-generated draft. Now, this draft that I'm going to show you on the next slide, we're going to look at it twice for two different activities, so I don't need you to read it all the way through on the first time. But we'll get a chance to do that in just a little bit. But what this activity does is really, instead of asking students to write a paper from beginning to end, which is by all means a valuable skill and something we should be doing, it's saying, let's try to isolate this and let's use AI to take away the obvious points, to take away the things that just anybody could say. Because the fact that AI generated this means just anybody's saying it, right? It's harvesting things from around the internet. It's kind of finding the middle, the sort of most basic possible response and giving it back to you. So I am going to ask AI to draft something in this case, but the purpose might surprise you. So I, as the teacher, asked AI to come up with this draft about the difference in the diction in these two stories. And what I could now do is hand this draft to my students, or more likely electronically give it to them, and say, hey, I used AI. Here's what it created. In some ways, what it created is a little bit good because it's focused. But in some ways, it's a little bit bad because it's boring and what many people describe as soulless when we have AI draft something. So what I would ask them to do is say, this is the most obvious answer to my question about how the diction differs in these two stories. But we've talked about these stories. We've annotated the paper copies of these stories. We've had good class discussions and worked in small groups of these stories. You're better than the AI. Take this in your computer, color code all this in blue, and then change anything you want to make these paragraphs stronger and deeper. Use this as a diving board to go deeper. You can cut anything you want. You can change anything you want. And by the end, I don't want it just going deeper. I want to hear your voice in it too. Because right now, this sounds pretty cardboard, pretty hollow. When I've asked students to do this, I'm really impressed with how they like the challenge because they've already got the sort of like basic skeleton of how to write this on the paper, but they like the challenge of uh, coming up with something more original than what AI can. Students often will first respond to something AI generated overly impressed with it in a way that we as teachers are not. And that's because it feels like it's above what they can do. But what I'm telling them with this assignment is no, you can do better than this. Show me how. And what's really cool is when you give this, someone will always ask, can I delete all of this? Like, can I use what I learned from it, but delete all of it? And I say, absolutely. And sometimes I get an entirely red fonted response, which has none of the original words and much deeper ideas, much stronger voice. So a pro tip on this one is to make sure you articulate the why behind this activity. We want to make sure we're like, clarifying that we're not teaching them how to cheat better with AI, right? Because that is one possible takeaway from that. But that we've crafted a specific assignment with the goal of pushing them deeper, helping them dive into the deep end, rather than be satisfied with a surface level response, whether it's from AI or whether one that they wrote from scratch. Okay, let's go on to a third one. And this third strategy, I would like to use the same passage and we'll do a little waterfall response with it too. So once again, I want to come back to that idea that I mentioned this in the book, that sometimes it kind of takes the wind out of my sails when a student says, but maybe I caught them using AI inappropriately. I don't think you wrote this paper. Let's talk. What happened here? They say, yeah, but what it writes sounds so good. Sounds so good. It shows they lack confidence as a writer. That tells me something about my student as a writer. But it also tells me that they are overly impressed with language that is AI generates precise language on one hand because it's exact at its things like punctuation and its production of language, and it creates something that's professional. It knows what an academic essay is supposed to sound like, and it imitates that really well. But what I'm curious, this made me curious when I had students telling me this, that what AI creates sounds so good. And when I pushed a little further, I found out sometimes what they mean is it's using words I don't feel comfortable using yet. And that's an interesting possibility with AI. What if we shared a draft? Students, let's imagine a different kind of assignment now. Students have already drafted something in their paper writer's notebook about the diction between the two. Now I give them an AI-generated piece, maybe up on the screen, and instead of saying comparing it or saying like, look how it did that in 2 seconds, and kids are like, yeah, it sounds better than I do. Let's not fall into that trap. Let's instead say, do you see any words that this is using that makes it sound really professional or spot on that you didn't think about using? Maybe it's even a word you know the definition, but you never use it in your writing. It's not part of your working vocabulary. Could we just highlight a few words that could maybe push you as a writer to expand your vocabulary? So here's what I'm going to ask you to do in the waterfall for a second. Could you, as you read over these two paragraphs, you're going to notice they're the hollow, soulless, AI style writing. And yet, they do use some really interesting vocabulary that we might wish our students knew how to use or had in their working vocabulary for writing. So I want just single word responses to sort of waterfall down this chat. Could we just call out some words here that you think would make help your student to improve their writing? I see caustic, juxtaposition, exasperation, mundane, lulls, amplifies. By the way, AI loves the verb amplifies. Gruesome, heighten. Yeah, look at that. I love what you're writing here. There are so many. Underscore is another verb, by the way, that AI loves. And I don't tell you those things. I don't tell you that that amplify and underscore are sometimes markers of AI created text. I don't tell you that to try to go catch kids. I do on my website talk about what happens when I catch kids using AI inappropriately. But I do tell you that because I think our students could benefit by thinking about how writers and artists underscore or amplify things. Like those aren't bad verbs for them to learn how to use. The problem is if they're copying and pasting whole sentences from other places. So what you might challenge students to do, if they've already done some writing in their paper notebooks, and then they're seeing an AI one, let's mine it for some good vocabulary and see whether they could use the word gruesome, which they might already know but didn't go for in their writing, or the word underscore or amplify, which are not particularly challenging words, but they're not words that they're going to have right at their fingertips, and see if they could build some of that in to their writing. Maybe they need to look up a word like caustic or mundane if they don't know those terms. Um, but what if we challenge it to say, look, it can actually be a model or a teacher in the same way that we've always used quality mentor texts. Now, I want to be really clear about something. A quality mentor text from a piece of literature or like Ted Chiang's article on in the New Yorker, those are always going to be more artful pieces to pull from. But AI can give us some instant pieces and can give us some things that do push our high school students to incorporate more vocabulary. So consider that as a possibility. Could we use it as a way to mine vocabulary without letting it take over our voice? Now you could go back and have students revise maybe 2 or 3 sentences and turn in those revised sentences with a new vocabulary word and see how they're doing with that work as well. I think one of the things, I'm going to put the chat away right now. Thank you for that. I think one of the things that we're noticing, though, is writing assignments and how we teach writing is changing. It is going to need to change a bit. So not every assignment, optimistically, I would like to see that not every assignment is a long paper anymore. I think those are absolutely valuable and need to be part of our students' experience. But we might get like frequent practice in revising or more frequent practice in applying new vocabulary because AI exists than we could before. So I challenge you to think about that in your teaching circumstances, whether there's a way you could do that. I also have to point out, we've all read the articles and seen the information about how AI will produce bias in its text and in its images. I'll talk about that in just a minute too. And it's really important to weave that in if you're going to allow students to use AI, or even if they're allowed to use it across the school on their school devices. It's important for them to get to be skilled at noticing when bias appears. So something that might be interesting in, let's say, a social studies class where you're studying about like colonial history in a certain part of the world, that's certainly a topic that is going to have bias depending on what perspective we're taking on that history. So why not get a little practice in that and say, guys, it can get biased output sometime. Let's ask it about, Christopher Columbus and see what it has to say. And can we highlight or underline some pieces where you think it's showing a bias either for or against the trajectory of how that exploration went in the course of human history? Like that could be a really interesting activity and a valuable one for students to learn. There's actually a lesson in the book called Bias Hunters about that. I want to point out something and I was really transparent with my students when this happened. I was using an AI image generator to generate some images about vocabulary words. And the word reprieve from Arthur Miller's The Crucible was a word that students sometimes struggle with. It's a little more complex. So I asked it to generate an image of a defendant in a courtroom who is granted a reprieve by a judge. And I want to point out a couple different things. First, bias in this picture. I mean, justice is served. Like everyone's happy. Like this outcome is just no one's displeased by it, which is actually pretty rare, right, in a courtroom. Number two, the judge is somewhere in the British Empire, not in the US because of that wig. And the lawyer apparently is in the US because he doesn't have the wig. So it's confusing a little bit in a way that the images often are. But let's be honest, the third one that's interesting here. When I said defendant, it gave me someone who's Black. And that was not something I asked for. And I tell students, I never ask for a particular race or gender of person. And it's really interesting to notice what race or gender it chooses when you prompt AI for different things. I'll tell you, this was the first time that with no prompting for race or gender, that AI generated the image of a Black man. And it happened when I mentioned a defendant in a courtroom, which is appalling, the bias that's built into that. But it's important for our students to understand that bias is in the human experience And because this technology is based on humans, the bias has been transferred to technological tools that we're using. They need to reckon with that. We can't use or introduce AI without exploring this and other moral complexities of AI. That's for sure. So make sure that we're not overlooking those important elements of the technology. Take a look at strategy number 4, syntax buffet. This is similar to using AI-generated text to expand our vocabulary, but this one is going to be more about the syntax. So one use that I learned from talking with students and other teachers was thinking about how AI could give us multiple ways to sort of untangle some kind of syntax that's giving us a hard time. We're trying to write a sentence. We know it doesn't sound great, but we're struggling to come up with other ways to phrase it. AI can do that quickly. Give me 3 ways, give me 5 ways, give me 10 ways to rephrase this sentence. And that's really great. And it can do it in seconds. But notice my second note on this slide. If we're going to use it in that way, we always want to help students to reflect on why a certain syntactic choice is best. Let me share. So in this case, I have a sentence. I actually included a typo in the sentence unintentionally, but that happens when we're working with prompting. And I gave it a sentence that says, Shirley Jackson and Dorothy Parker are both writing to look at problems in the real world, but they changed things around to make an exaggerated situation. So it should say, the problem stands out. The problems stand out. Can you rephrase that for me? I'm trying to work on it. Now I want to point out that this is a 2-slide demonstration because on the first slide, when it rephrased it, in my opinion, and sharing this example with students, I would say it rephrased it in a way that didn't sound at all like me anymore. Like I didn't really like the fact that it lifted the diction almost too much, more than I wanted it to. There's that word amplify again, right? Likes that word. So what I said is, can you do that again, but change it so it uses my original words, just rearranging the sentence structure. Again, I'm doing this quickly. I didn't spell rearranging right? That's realistic. Kids are going to do that. So down here, it did that, and it gave me a couple of different structures. When I look at example number 1, I notice that it's in a compound sentence with the comma and conjunction. Sentence number 2, reverse the order of ideas. So I could get to see it if the sentence starts with the idea of real problems and then moves on to the concept of exaggeration. And then in number 3, it used an introductory segment of the sentence in their writing. Shirley Jackson and Dorothy Parker look at real-world problems. And then a participial phrase, altering details to create exaggerated situations that emphasize these issues. Now, I love that students could look at one of those and take ultimately their words, but a different structure, and use it in their writing. But I also want to point out that this is a piece that I use along with that technique. I ask them to write down on a separate handout, and they don't have to do this for every sentence they do this with, but I want them to do it a couple times if they're using this technique in their writing. The original line, the revised line from the AI, and then why do you like the revised version better? What does it do that the original does not? Just a short anecdote. I had a student who let me back up a second. Currently in my school, I think someone asked this question earlier about how AI use looks in my school. The major LLMs are all blocked on our computers. So students are using them absolutely outside of school, and I'm trying to teach them how to use them well when they're allowed to do so. But in school, they're not. They don't have access to that just yet. That's coming at some point, but it's not yet. So I had a student who was, he was definitely a student who looks for the easy way out on things. And he uncovered a tool in our available school laptop repertoire of tools that did have AI built into it and did exactly this. It gave multiple ways to rephrase a sentence. And he showed it to me kind of like, hee, look what I found. This handout came from that experience with that kid. I said, honestly, tell me what you like about this. Which of these 3 is the best? It came from a conversation. Why do you like this one better than the others? I said, listen, you can use this anytime you want, but I'm going to give you this little handout, and I want you to, when you use it, show me at least 3 reflections on why you made the changes. He did, and his reflections, like he invested in this assignment, which was really exciting to see. Okay, I'm rambling. There's a waterfall here, so I'm going to pull up my chat again. Oops, let me go back. Where's my chat? There it is. Could you share for a moment what you notice when you look at this handout? Like, what purpose do you notice behind the scenes? Using your teacher brain here, what's the purpose of having them slow down with something that makes us move faster? Everyone's noticing the speed of AI first and foremost, but what's the purpose in having them slow down a bit? We get a couple of different comments on that in the waterfall. Yeah, reflection to shift to the student responsibility. Good. Considering other perspectives, it causes the students to think about what they're doing and how they're using AI. Yeah, think about how this invites them to critically think about their writing choices. I like that Linda can create an internal struggle. Like, writing is a struggle. Writing is hard. It's wonderful. And when you create something you're proud of, it is such an empowering experience. We don't want AI to steal that from students. That's why we're here talking about it tonight. Consciously consider what makes something sound better. And I love that, Matthew, putting that in quotes, right? What makes it sound better? What I hope they'll notice, they might not be able to name the participial phrase like I did or the introductory uh, piece of that third sentence. They might not notice the reversal of the ideas, but they still have to articulate in their own words in a sentence why the line is better than their original. So what it's doing is it's asking them to slow down and notice a little bit more. And I want to say that in my book, I think that's a theme that a reader pointed out to me. It wasn't even something I noticed as I was putting it together, but that I'm using a fast technology to actually slow down students and make them stop and think. And I think that is a really, once that reader pointed that out to me, I think it's a philosophy I want to kind of take forward. We could use something fast to think slowly too. Linda, writing is thinking. Let's not let AI take away thinking. That's exactly it. So every time I'm allowing it or giving them a new strategy to work with, I'm asking them to think. And Valerie points out evaluative choices. That's a nice level of thinking to take students to, and articulating their reason is making them slow down and think. Okay, very good. I'm going to put the chat away for a minute. And thank you so much, everybody, for jumping in on those comments. That really makes the webinar lively, helps me know what you're thinking about too. So I also want to add in here, since as we're talking about syntax and things like grammar related to that, that AI can also be really useful in creating personalized guides for students. I have a chapter on this in the book, even though it's a little different than the student-facing lessons. This is about a teacher using it for student-facing guides. So my prompt at the bottom, if you're working with a literary analysis essay and you're finding in the drafting process that students, or maybe in your last essay, students just are not getting comma splices or understanding what they are, asking an AI to generate a guide and using the genre within which you're writing, whether it's a literary analysis or personal narrative or whatever. And of course, I'm using English class examples, but that could be like a lab report if you'd like, if you're a science teacher. It will really tailor them nicely, and you could do it quickly on multiple LLMs, which are all different. In fact, in the book, I demonstrate how Gemini's output was friendlier than the others. Quads gave more example than the others. ChatGPT was very quick and pragmatic and to the point. And so you could take that and very quickly put together one that's just for your class. You could even, since it does learn with us, you could even have the AI start to employ your sense of humor or your students' interests in these guides that it creates about something as boring as a comma splice. So that's a thing to keep in mind as we work with syntax and grammar with AI. Here are 2 questions I think we should all, I think we're all, if we're here tonight, you're probably already reckoning with these questions. When should we revise assignments? Not to make them AI proof, but to discourage AI use, to maximize motivation for students to write it on their own. That is something this year that I'm going to focus on. Like what revisions can I make to amplify or underscore the students' motivation to do this on their own? And then when should we carefully invite AI into existing assignments? If you haven't done that yet, I'm going to encourage you to find one assignment this school year where you can invite it into existing assignments. You should review what cheating looks like and what it doesn't look like with AI, what you're envisioning that line is for that particular assignment. But if you allow students to do it, and then ask them to reflect on the process, ask them to be incredibly transparent with you about how they're doing it, you will learn from your students. That is the number one thing that I can say has been exciting about working with AI so far, is getting to be a learner with them. And that's only true for this narrow part of this AI's history, that we get to be sort of on a little bit of a level playing field. I used this phrase in a podcast recently, and I think it's sticking a little bit, that we need to have ruthless reflection in our work with AI. In the book, I interview two students, Adam and Jake, who talk about how much being allowed to use AI benefited them, even when I was asking them to be transparent and not just use it as like some kind of copy and paste. But then I want you to meet Matteo, who's a student who doesn't love English class, who doesn't love writing. And he would not be upset with me saying that. He would say it to your face too. Nice kid, just English isn't his thing. He tried using AI and he's excited to use it. And I just said, tell me how you're using it. If you take any language directly from it, I want it color coded. I want to understand where this takes your brain. Here's what he wrote. I feel like the AI was very accurate, but most of the information was over communicated and it did not really get to the point. In the future, if I had to choose, I would probably write the whole essay on my own because it shows what skills somebody has. Writing challenges you to come up with your own ideas instead of piggybacking from someone else. Okay, I almost don't care what Matteo's essay sounds like. I care about this. I care about a breakthrough for a student that's not very engaged in writing in English. He's rejecting and deciding, I don't think I'm going to come back to this in the future. And that is a valid decision to make. I support him in that, and I'm never going to pressure him to use it. But by allowing him to use it and to explore it, he was able to articulate this decision that made me proud. I'm also proud of Adam and Jake, who made a different decision, and you can read about their comments in the book. But I wanted to share with you Matteo's story and emphasize the importance of ruthless reflection. So here's my last waterfall response before we get to the end. And oh, sorry, spoiler. When we get to the end and talk about some of your questions, what are your experiences listening to kids teaching you so far? I shared an experience a little bit there, and I know this is tough to put into just a short bit in the chat. But what are some things you're learning? It doesn't even have to be full sentences. It could just be a quick snippet by listening to students when they talk about AI. And by the way, some of what they say may make you hate AI more, and that's okay too. Yeah, unnatural voice. Yes, Sarah, they're still figuring it out too. Absolutely. And we can be guides in that. Like sometimes we're being guides to help kids learn how to reason, to be more open-minded. They just go to it automatically. Eighth graders feel like it's a form of cheating. Yes, they really think it can think. April, thank you for bringing that up. Like that shows we need to educate them more on what AI is and is not. Middle school kids are afraid of AI. Students haven't discussed it with me. Some students thought it would be an easy way to cheat and find it boring. Like they miss participating in learning. Elizabeth, that's a good feeling when they're like, I really wonder how much that's going to happen over time, where they miss the participation in learning. And Sarah, they want us to talk to them about it. That's so very true. Bernhard, I think you'd love my article on what I say when I have a piece in front of me that I know is cheating. Like we all have had that experience. We're like, this is absolutely not the kid's voice, not even close. On my website, I have an article about that. I think you'll enjoy. They're anxious about when and how it's appropriate to use. Lindsay, thanks for bringing that up too. When I share with my students that I don't know everything about this, I haven't made final decisions on everything about this. it eases that anxiety and says, let's just cool it a little bit and work together on this. And now we're having good conversation, something that's been threatened in the classroom a little bit uh, in our modern era too. Oh, Sandra, thank you for pointing out teacher candidates using it to create lessons. Um, I find it can be interesting to reference in creating lessons, but not great at the actual creation of lessons. Like I don't mind having it as that rubber duck when I'm writing my lessons, but I don't want it actually doing it for me. I could do better than it can. All right. Thank you so much for all of those comments. And Ziri, that's a really great point that really weak kids who are desperate to please really rely on it. So many people are pointing out that the more transactional students feel about school, um, the the more likely they are to use it. Um, I forget where that QR code leads, but maybe you used it. Sorry. Let's move on to the next slide. So, if you know me a little bit, you know that I start class every day with a poem. My first book is about that, though it's not about daily poetry. It's about using poetry to teach aspects of writing in all sorts of genres. Um, my students, if you'd ask them, would know me as the poetry guy, not the AI guy. Although I've talked about it in all the ways that I've shared tonight, some students were surprised that I wrote a book about it but they weren't surprised I wrote a book about poetry. So I share that with you because I'm proud of it. I'm proud that they know me as the poetry guy and that I'm exploring the AI and I'm working with them, but I'm not letting it hijack what my class is and what writing instruction is for them. So aspire, like I want us all to be that way, that we have it in our scope, but it's not what defines us. If that makes sense. So I'm sharing this poem with you that Joseph Asano was kind enough to let me republish inside the book too. For the student who used AI to write a paper by Joseph Asano. Maybe you'll share this poem with your students and talk about it. Now I let it fall back in the grasses. I hear you. I know this life is hard now. I know your days are precious on this earth. But what are you trying to be free of? The living? The miraculous task of it? Love is for the ones who love the work. You could give poetry snaps. I want to point out the irony that in his title, he used the word use pretty broadly, which I critiqued earlier in the piece. But he's talking about someone who used it to replace their thinking, right? We get that. He's talking about someone who replaced themselves with something AI generated. I love these lines in orange, but what are you trying to be free of? The living, the miraculous task of it? Look at, I mean, AI would never put miraculous and task next to each other, but look how marvelous those two words sound near each other and the meaning they create together, that living is a miraculous task. The participant who commented earlier that some students get bored of it, they miss participating in their learning. Remind them of that. We are forming a relationship with technologies. Catherine Price's book, How to Break Up with Your Phone, acknowledges that we all entered a relationship with our smartphones before we really thought about what we wanted that relationship to be. Talk to kids about that. What kind of a relationship are you going to form with this? And how will it be a healthy one, not one that takes away part of your miraculous task of living and growing and being a beautiful human being? So I hope that you'll keep in touch with me. This QR code takes you to my website, but if you know my name, it's easy to remember, brettvogelsinger.com. On social media, I'm at the Vogelman as well. And one more way to keep in touch, I'll just pause on this for a second in case you're pulling up that QR code, but here's a second QR code. If you want to bookmark a couple sites. This one will take you to sign up for my newsletter, which I call a pleasant surprise. It's not an accident that it's called that because it really is delivered to your inbox whenever I have the time to put one together, which if you're a full-time teacher with a full load of classes like I am, you know, that's not always a given. Some days you have it and some days you don't. It's a pleasant surprise when it shows up in your inbox. If you'd like to sign up for that newsletter and get more, not just about AI, about poetry, about teaching, about thinking with kids. And I hope that you'll share what you're doing with it. I love learning from teachers around the world. I'm so honored that we have people from countries throughout the world on this call tonight. And if you're watching later on, I'm glad that you took the time to do that too. Thank you so much for those who are watching it on the recording. So that brings my part to an end. I'm going to hand it back to Margaret, and we'll close it up.
Yeah, we did have one question
Sure.
earlier saying, is everyone using ChatGPT? If not, which ones do you use with students?
So like I said, because they're not on student laptops, I am currently unable to use it with students in the class. When we make that move, it's going to be for us, because we're in Microsoft School, it's going to be Copilot, because there's safeties and compliances with US law that protect student privacy when we use that sort of closed system that Copilot provides to Microsoft clients in schools. But that's going to differ depending on where you are and what your district is doing with this.
Okay. Well, I will just say thank you, Brett. I love that you presented strategies to uphold the standards of how students think deeply and create beautifully with generative AI. And I also love the fact knowing you that you ended with a poem. So
Thanks.
just another thank you to Brett for this insightful webinar. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.
Have a good night.